The most miserable city in America. Apparently, it's Gary, Indiana. Spoiler alert. Um, I know that that's right outside of Chicago, and I've heard like some things about it, like maybe it's difficult to live there. But yeah,
This video is sponsored by
I want to know
Brew.
the details.
This is the road that leads to Gary, Indiana, or at least it used to. A while back, the neighboring city of Hammond was resurfacing this road and decided it was better to add a berm at the end of it so it didn't lead to Gary anymore. The fewer the connections, the better was the thinking. And when you do get into Gary, it feels like a whole different world. It's emptier, quieter,
look at the plants growing on that beautiful building. That's sad.
Vacant homes and overgrown lots. It's like a city forgotten, despite being in one of the largest metropolitan areas in the United States. It was once a thriving steel city, and its former glory days are apparent in the stunning, if crumbling, architecture. This steep decline in fortunes led Business Insider to label Gary the most miserable city in the United States in 2019. They based their rankings on statistics like unemployment and poverty rates. Business Insider is only the latest in a long line of publications dissing the city. Time magazine called Gary, Indiana, the very model of urban decay. As early as the 1950s, it was described as full of sin, crime, and open immorality. This immorality was shrouded.
Dang, they're gonna go hard on this little town. Why don't they try and help?
In a black pall of smoke from the steel mills. In 1994, Gary was dubbed the murder capital of the U.S., as it had the highest rate of murders per capita of any city in the country.
Oh, man.
Today, it doesn't even crack the top 10 most dangerous places in Indiana, let alone the United States. It feels hollowed out, as its population has dropped from 178,000 in 1960 to just 69,000 today. Now, Gary's story is a lot like other Rust Belt cities in the United States, but the fall here was greater. Now, one question I have, because I'm a bit of an optimist, is there a turnaround in store for Gary? So let's talk about Gary's history and its future after the bike belt.
The what? The bike belt?
This video is actually a personal one for me because my wife is from Northwest Indiana, from this region, and my father-in-law was actually born and raised here in Gary. I used to drive to college through this area and wondered who lived here, and it turns out my future wife did, and now I'm spending a lot of my vacation time here in Gary in Northwest Indiana. So I've always been fascinated with this city, and I'm so excited to be doing a video about it. So let's get into the history. If you drive through Gary on Interstate 90, you can't miss Gary Works. It was the largest steel mill in the world for many years, and is still the largest in North America.
So let me guess. They moved out and left it in ruins.
Maybe known as the Steel City, but no city's fortunes have been tied closer to steel than Gary. In fact, U.S. Steel founded Gary, and the name comes from Albert Gary, the founding chairman of U.S. Steel. Its location at the southern end of Lake Michigan is no accident. U.S. Steel owned iron mines throughout the region, and this area could receive shipments via Great Lakes Freighter or railroad. The Standard Oil refinery in nearby Whiting proved a model for U.S. Steel, as it succeeded in the same strategic location. The city was founded in 1906, and the mills produced their first steel in 1909. U.S. Steel understood that they needed to build a city for its workers, as it was too far away from Chicago for regular daily commuting before the freeway era. They needed to build a company town, and Gary would eventually grow to be the largest company town in the United States. Many past...
It's crazy how these little towns could be so huge and then just turn into nothing, you know?
Company towns came with a big dose of paternalism. Company founders would want to create cities to ensure its residents were moral, upstanding, diligent workers. This often meant that the company owned the homes the workers lived in and the stores they shopped at. Great for the company, not so great for the workers. One famous example is nearby Pullman, Illinois, home of the company that built fancy railroad cars. It was by all accounts a nice-looking village, and George Pullman hoped it could be a model for urban planning. But when the factory had to cut hours due to lower demand for the rail cars, they didn't cut rents or prices in the company's stores. Workers rose up, and the ensuing Pullman strike is one of the defining...
Why would they do something like that that's actually nice for people? Why would they do that?
The U.S. labor movement. The Illinois Supreme Court ruled that the company had to divest its ownership of non-factory property, and the city was annexed into Chicago. This all happened in 1894, only 12 years before Gary was founded. U.S. Steel wanted to avoid that outcome. Thus, Gary was planned as a community where workers would own their own homes and democratically elect their own completely separate city government. The lack of paternalistic vision was probably wise, but it led to a rather bland urban design. Sense. Fifth Avenue and Broadway were the two major thoroughfares, with Broadway leading directly to Union Station and U.S. Steel. The rest of the city was divided up into a grid with 40 houses per block, connected by streets that were quite wide, at 80 to 100 feet. There was one big problem with the plan to have employees own their own houses. Most employees did not make enough to build a home or buy a newly built one. Many workers ended up in tents or 3-room shacks that could house up to 20 workers. U.S. Steel got into home construction to try and house more workers, but even their modestly priced housing was out of reach of the lowest paid unskilled workers. Land promoters and speculators built ramshackle barracks and tenement housing to fill the gap. The fledgling city government had no regulations that required amenities like running water, so they were absolutely terrible places to live.
No!
Gary may have avoided the paternalistic model of Pullman, but created their own sort of urban anarchy. The situation was made worse by a lack of public open space. The mills spread across the entirety of Gary's lakeshore, so there's no recreation there. The only recreation, it seemed, could be found in the local taverns. By the 1910s, there was one tavern for every 88 Gary residents. Even at this early stage in the history of Gary, it had a reputation for being bigger than life, an industrial colossus, but also a den of sin, filled with low-wage single men spending what little they had on alcohol and gambling. From this inauspicious start, Gary grew with the fortunes of the steel industry. The population doubled between 1920 and 1940 and reached a peak of 178,000 in 1960. With population growth came demographic change. Much of the early growth had been from Eastern European immigrants, often discriminated against by white workers who had been in the country for a generation or more. Those Eastern European immigrants forged tight-knit communities that characterized Gary's early history. Gary was also a destination for Southern Black workers as a part of the Great Migration, a demographic shift that saw millions of Black Americans resettling in industrial cities of the North. As the new minority in town, Black workers faced discrimination, and by the 1940s and 1950s, white workers had begun to move out of Gary to nearby suburbs, an example of the white flight phenomenon. This exodus became a flood after 1967.
So strange.
This was a mayoral election year, and incumbent Mayor Martin Katz had the endorsement of the Democratic machine and Union Steelworkers. But Black residents favored Richard Hatcher, a moderate who campaigned on ending patronage and cleaning up corruption. Hatcher won, becoming with Carl Stokes of Cleveland the first Black mayors of major American cities. Many white residents took that as their cue to leave, not willing to live in a city where Black residents made up the majority and having a mayor that was also Black. Gary's population declined between 1960 and 1970,
That's why the population decreased?
the first time in its history. Meanwhile, Gary became the center of the Black political landscape, hosting the 1972 Black Political Convention. Black residents of Gary during this time were proud of their city and happy to have some measure of political control. It's unfortunate that this change in political landscape came at the exact moment U.S. Steel began to lay off its workers. In 1967, 65% of Gary workers were employed at Gary Works. That's an insanely high percentage for one employer. During this era, 30,000 people worked there. But Gary steel mills began to fall victim to deindustrialization. This is when one region's industries decline, often because it becomes cheaper to import the same goods from somewhere else.
I told y'all, I knew it happened. You could just tell this is what always happens. Companies have too much power in one little city and then they just leave it in ruins, and it's horrible, and it stays like that forever.
This phenomenon struck the entire Rust Belt
kind
of the
like what happened in Detroit.
But perhaps none as hard as Gary.
To just struggle.
U.S. Steel cut thousands of jobs in the 1970s and 1980s. Production at the mills actually picked up in the 80s and 90s, and they were producing as much steel as ever, but automation had rendered most jobs obsolete.
Yep.
By the 1990s, only about 6,000 people worked in the steel mills.
From 30.
What happens when a hastily built company town sees massive job losses from its primary employer, while also succumbing to extreme levels of white flight? And they were leaving, Well, Gary's population plummeted. By 1990, only 116,000 people lived in the city. The population freefall continues to the present day. The recently released 2020 census shows Gary is home to only 69,000 people. It's lost over 100,000 residents in 60 years. Today, only about 3,000 people work at the plant. Cities aren't designed to lose population, especially not this fast. As cities grow, they add infrastructure like sewers, power lines, schools, libraries, and roads. Tax dollars pay for those services. When most people leave, the infrastructure is still there and costs money to maintain and operate. Without tax revenues, these services can fall into disrepair. That's what's happening in Gary. 70,000 people who can't pay for a city meant for 170,000. As a result, the city is using what little money they have to demolish buildings, most notably its empty public schools. It's cheaper to demolish them than maintain them empty. Today, Gary only has one public high school.
What do you have to do to maintain an empty building like that? I wonder what they even do. Like, why does that cost money? Does anyone know? Probably
left.
somebody.
It used to have a half a dozen.
One of you knows.
Many of Gary's churches are also empty and falling apart. There aren't enough people left to fill the pews. Is it possible to pull Gary out of this nosedive? Well, on paper, Gary has some real positive attributes. It's still close to the city of Chicago, and you can catch a commuter rail that will take you to Millennium Station. Gary is also unique because its boundaries overlap with a national park, Indiana Dunes. It has a minor league baseball team, the Railcats, who can still draw a crowd on game days. Miller Beach, a wealthier and whiter enclave of Gary, still has some life left in it. And housing, unsurprisingly, is extremely affordable here. The city's been trying to promote its airport as an option for a third Chicago airport. O'Hare and Midway are operating at capacity, and there is significant local opposition to expanding O'Hare. The state of Illinois wants to build an airport in-state, but Gary's airport could easily be upgraded to handle significant passenger volumes. If that happens, it would give Gary another economic engine besides.
Let's see, this video was 2 years ago. So who knows? I haven't heard anything.
Steel.
Yeah, that would be good.
Schools and infrastructure remain a big concern, however. Gary has closed so many of its neighborhood schools that families may not want to relocate to the area. The biggest barrier, however, may simply be perception. In the 1990s, Gary was rife with gang activity and violence. It's doing better today, but an entire generation of people associate Gary with that reputation.
You got to start marketing.
If you drive through Gary and look past the overgrown lots and empty streets, you see an amazing history. It had once been thriving, and I hesitate to count Gary out. It faces problems greater than any city its size, and it has since it was founded back in 1906. But there is beauty here too, and I hope that the days of a growing Gary come soon. If Gary does make a comeback, it will truly be a fascinating story. The kind of story you might find in one of the frequent short articles posted in Morning Brew, a free daily newsletter delivered to your inbox every day of the week. Morning Brew keeps you up to speed on all the news and current events you need to know about business, finance, and tech in only 5 minutes in a way that's more informative, witty, and relevant than traditional news. It cuts through the clutter and gives you what you need every morning. For example, when I was writing this script, I got to read about an update on the broken international supply chain, a Chinese real estate development group on the verge of collapse, and the wrapping of the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. I really appreciate that I can read about business and art from 2 different parts of the world in one newsletter. Since you watch this channel, I know you like getting smarter about the world around you.
That's kind of nice.
So go ahead and start your mornings with Morning Brew by subscribing, completely for free, using the link in the description. It's one of the best ways you can support this channel for free, and you get to stay up to date on current events. There aren't many win-wins as good as this. Thanks as always for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.
Cool, that was a good video. Really quick, it was 2 years ago. So if anybody is from that area, let me know how it's growing. I'm kind of curious. Maybe it's gotten a little better, I hope. But yeah, like you said, there's kind of a stigma around Gary, Indiana. Like I've heard of Gary, Indiana, and not in nice terms, you know what I mean? It was really interesting. But yeah, I'll leave the video in the description if you want to go watch it. Leave a like and let me know if you want me to watch something down in the comments, and I will see you in the next one.